I'm here with Tracie Morris. Hello, Tracie.
Hi, Al.
So good to see you. We're doing a very brief conversation about kind of an old school poem by Richard Wilbur called Cottage Street, 1953, an intriguing poem, which is a recollection many years later of an afternoon, a luncheon that he spent with Sylvia Plath, a kind of an arranged lunch. So I'll read it and we'll talk about it. Cottage Street, 1953. Framed in her Phoenix fire screen, Edna Ward bends to the tray of Canton, pouring tea for frightened Mrs. Plath, then turning toward the pale, slumped daughter and my wife and me. Asks if we would prefer it weak or strong. Will we have milk or lemon, she inquires. The visit seems already strained and long. Each in his turn, we tell her our desires. It is my office to exemplify the published poet in his happiness, thus cheering Sylvia, who has wished to die, but half ashamed and impotent to bless. I am a stupid lifeguard who has found, swept to his shallows by the tide, a girl who, far from shore, has been immensely drowned and stares through water now with eyes of pearl. How large is her refusal? How slight the genteel chat whereby we recommend life of a summer afternoon despite the brewing dusk which hints that it may end. And Edna Ward shall die in 15 years after her 80 summers of such grace and courage as permit no tears, the thin hand reaching out, the last word, love. Outliving Sylvia, who condemned to live, shall study for a decade as she must, to state at last her brilliant negative in poems free and helpless and unjust. Tracie, I'm going to start with the biggest question, which is we have a formalist poem, a poem constantly conscious of formalities, rhyme, rhythm, figuration. How does that relate to the story he wants to tell about meeting Sylvia Plath at the home of this Edna Ward? What does the form have to do with the content?
Wow. It's quite an interesting question. I mean, I think the idea of formality here works extremely effectively with the notion of the box, the pine box, the notion that this is an inescapable moment which nobody's going to get out of alive. And of course, we're reading about this now, posthumously to these characters. It's poignant, and I'm happy to think about Wilbur because I think the stereotype a lot is that people who like innovative work don't like formal work or don't like conventional work. And it's really, I've found the opposite. Many of us study and deeply appreciate convention and then decide we're going to extrapolate certain things from it. So I think here, the idea of the formal and this particular rhyme scheme, the AB rhyme scheme, is really effective because, well, there's a couple of things I just want to mention. In your reading of the poem, Alan, I think this is true for you especially, but certainly a lot of people who would read Wilbur, who would hear Wilbur read. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, you don't even think about what the rhyme is for a while. You know, just like in the first stanza, you're not really hearing the rhyme. It comes across much more clearly in the second stanza. Mm-hmm. And that has a lot to do with the enjambment, but I think it's just, he has this very masterful way of making us forget about form. Mm-hmm. But the constraints become more and more pronounced in the text as we go along. So in this context, the idea of death being nearby or that death is coming is reinforced by how clearly the form comes across. And I think many of my reflections on this poem, as well as Wilbur in general, especially his translations of Molière, have to do with him making us forget form and then remember form.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think he does that so well. So, and in this particular case, talking about Plath and Edna Ward, there's this contrast of this woman who's very, very polite, very Miss Manners, who outlives Sylvia Plath, like the young girl who's a woman who's already tried to commit self-harm, who is negotiating with her young life. And this woman, Edna Ward, has like sort of seen it all and has a different kind of perspective.
Right.
Maybe that's why she decided to have this tea, because she wanted to offer her another way of thinking about how life could work out, which is what Wilbur is saying here.
Right.
But we also know by the constraints that it's not going to work out for her. It worked out for Edna Ward, even though she died.
Yeah. Mm.
And then there's also one more thing, I guess, getting a little excited about this, and that is the regret, which is also a ghost that Wilbur is conveying in this poem.
Mm. Constraint. I love the use of the word constraint in your response. Edna Ward stands for the beauties of constraint, or the longevity, the survivability, the longevity of someone who respects constraint. This is a New England tea, right? And Sylvia, who's slumped and not a constraint tea party going type, is being brought here to be exposed not just to Mrs. Ward's love of constraint and the perfect tea pouring, but also Wilbur, who's a poet and seems to, through the poem, we understand he respects the constraint, right? So there's like Edna Ward and her young avatar of constraint trying to politely persuade Sylvia to follow along, So this is such a smart way for Wilbur to say something that's pretty unpopular among cool cats like you and me and others who love to break free of old-fashioned formal constraint. It's a very wise thing. He's saying Mrs. Ward will last a long time. There's something to be said about constraint. What is your response to what I just said about constraint?
Well,
I called you a cool cat.
Yeah. I love it. I love it because I think that what you're talking about is super interesting. It's not just constraint to be conservative in the sort of political sense, which is how a lot of people might interpret it. It's conservation of energy. How in those days, especially 88, that's not, it's significant now. It was especially significant then. So what she's saying is that this kind of constraint, this sort of appeal to convention in certain ways, allows for a longevity in terms of how you can extend a sort of energy, a type of energy. Mm-hmm. That includes poetics, right?
Tracie, I have two more questions for you. I'll tell you what they both are, and then you can pick both or one to respond to. The first question is, how are we supposed to take his self-criticism that he has been brought there to cheer Sylvia, but he kind of gets the sense that he's not going to be able to do it and that he's a stupid lifeguard. His job is to save her from drowning, but he's not going to do it. I'm a stupid lifeguard who has found, swept to his shallows by the tide, a girl who, far from shore, has been immensely drowned. And then he refers to Shakespeare, stares through water now with eyes of pearl. How are we supposed to take that? Is he really sad about not fulfilling his performed duty? And the second question, which is not quite related, is how are we to take the last line in the word unjust, which is a very big word, unjust. It means about 5 different things there, and it rhymes with must. And I'm just curious how you deal with that. Which one of those questions do you want to take?
Come on, I'm going to address both of those questions.
Okay. All right.
Great questions.
Good.
And then I could say I'm not like a Wilbur I'm not a Wilbur expert. I only know like a little bit about his work. It's just really struck me. So, I might, to somebody who's a Wilburist, I might be, just winging it. But so the first thing about him being a lifeguard or his regret, I think it goes back again to the idea of performance. You get a sense that this tea that Edna Ward has set up, everybody has a role to play.
Right.
Right? It's Wilbur and Wilbur's wife and Wilbur's mother-in-law and Sylvia Plath's unseen mother and Sylvia Plath. So there's like 5 people involved in this story.
Yes.
And he has a sense of regret because he's playing a particular role, and then he's saying afterwards, why couldn't I save her? Is it because he was in the role? Is it because he wasn't convincing her that she had a role to continue to play? Mm-hmm. Is this a very low grade, very hot middle brow intervention?
Right.
Or is it just an indulgence by somebody older who likes to have tea and have young people around?
Right.
I don't get the sense that it's the latter, because Edna Ward comes across as very wise, wise enough to know that love is at the end, not despair. So that goes to the last word, unjust. And I think this becomes a really powerful word in the context of ModPo, because maybe Wilbur is saying ultimately about constraint is that poetics failed, that the poetry community failed, that the context of poetry failed Plath, and that is why she died, and he was complicit in that.
Wow. To state at last her brilliant negative, which would be what she did in her poems, in poems that are free and helpless and unjust. Free, this is not free verse, the poem we've just read. So basically, Wilbur survives. He, by the way, lived to be, there's a lot of longevity in Richard Wilbur. Not that we could connect it to his formal poetry, but certainly we can connect Sylvia's brief existence, troubled existence, to the poems that eschewed formality, just in terms of psychic health and so forth. Poems free and helpless and unjust, there's the candle burning at both ends. And Wilbur or his speaker, seems to be mildly taking the side of longevity and Edna Ward and that kind of custom. And that's why he can't help her, because he doesn't know from poems that are free. But unjust, I mean, wow, that's potentially a criticism, the first criticism we've heard, possibly, from the speaker, no? Unjust, unjustified, unfair?
Well, the thing is, he's not judging her. He's not judging Plath in this poem. It's a different context in which we experience her and know about her work. Yeah. So I think if he's saying unjust, he's not saying anything derogatory towards her. That's why it's brilliant negative, Yeah,
right.
So who's failing? Who's unjust if it's not her?
And so you're saying that is the poetry community or the Wilburs of the world, or, if someone summons you as a poet to a tea where you're trying to save somebody and you fail to do so, then your poetry is at stake. What good is your poetry if it can't save a poet?
Right. And so there's no more poems.
Yeah.
Right? There's no more poems from that person. And then, I think that that's a really great question you ask, because it's like when we have these poetry wars, it's like, really, they truly are tempests in teapots, like in this case, literally, right?
Yeah.
But not when you lose a life.
Yeah, this is so cool. I think what you just said is really powerful. Wilbur's saying, look, if you think about Plath and Wilbur, about me and Sylvia, you think about poets who stand at the opposite end of spectrums. But we're both poets, and we need to try to be as nice to each other as possible and stop thinking of ourselves as opposites. Something like that, which is sort of what you're doing in this, to borrow a description of Edna Ward, grace and courageous. there's a certain grace and courage in your concern about Wilbur's talents as a translator of Molière, your open-heartedness in thinking this is the poem we should talk about. You know, we're all in this together.
And we're all performing. We're performing in these various roles. There's no real separation. It's just variety.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Tracie, that's great. I really didn't expect that we'd end up there, but I'm so glad. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us about Wilbur.
Thank you for inviting me. I mean, I love talking about these old school heads. They're like, they're fantastic. They're fantastic.
We're going to do it again. We're going to do it again. Thank you, Tracie Morris.
Thank you.
If you liked this episode, watch another and subscribe.
And join us for ModPo, a free and open course at modpo.org.